No mics, no wires. We do this fast and clean and simple.
Then you don't do it at all.
What the?
Seems to me you all could have had this fight between yourselves before calling in the state's attorney's office.
Alex Cottrell and Toby Huntingford present Caught on the Wire. This podcast is an episode-by-episode analysis of HBO's widely acclaimed TV series about the city of Baltimore, its people, and its many problems. Find more information about the show and all the episodes online at caughtonthewire.wordpress.com. Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Caught on the Wire podcast. If you're joining us from having listened to the first one, then big thank you for sticking with us as we make our journey through every single episode of The Wire, trying to give a decent critical analysis of what goes on with the story and what goes on with extra details like the epigraph and the title, which we covered. Which, if you listened to the first episode, you would have heard how the format works, what our spoiler policy is, and that we usually start off with a little bit of a recap, which aren't exactly our favourite things, are they, Toby? But we know we have to do them.
Should we get on with it?
Yeah, let's jump right in.
The game is rigged, but you cannot lose if you do not play.
Right, okay, so Season 1, Episode 2, The Detail. This episode, a lot of it is defined by a bulking out of the detail crew that was established previously. So we see other departments dump their dead wood, and we're joined by Lester Freeman, Roland Presbalewski, Augustus Polk, and Patrick Mahone. And Daniels is less than impressed with these people, deems them very bad police, and takes it as a message from the deputy ops that the higher-ups are after some quick, easy, buy-bust police work. And then Daniels spends much of the episode trying to salvage this detail. And since he's in charge, he knows that the useless hunts has been sent will eventually become his responsibility anyway, and he'll face the firing line for not reacting to the judge's questions. So, I mean, his only success story in doing this is bargaining for Sidner out of Lieutenant Cantrell, who's a very respectable officer. And the pressures that Daniels is under, they will culminate in the final scene with his wife, Marla Daniels, who's also introduced this episode. And she implores him to get out of it, with the epigraph this time around. You cannot lose if you do not play. In terms of the actual work of the detail itself, the only progress we make here is, with Bubbles and his, hat trick routine. So Bubbles masquerades as a street hat salesman whilst Greggs and Carver photograph the important players, and McNulty's very impressed when he sees the intelligence it's allowed them to bring to the table, and spoils Bubbles with some payment. In other sort of streams here, we have McNulty and Bunk detaining and interrogating D'Angelo under logical suspicion of being involved in the camp murder, and it's not long before Maurice Levy, who we saw a fleeting glance of last time in the courtroom, he comes to the rescue for D'Angelo, and the cops are unfortunately none the wiser from D'Angelo, but they have taken a letter away that he was willing to write, a remorseful letter to William Gant's children, the witness who was slaughtered for testifying. I think the cops are also taken aback by how empathetic D'Angelo is, and it's a very unconventional interrogation room interview, and this is a fact that may play into their favour later on. The detail itself, once it's getting underway, appears to be more interested in overtime, and very dissatisfied with the lack of a hands-on approach to policing. Most people express disinterest with the hat routine and the slow approach to intel. This culminates with Prez, Carver, and Hurt going to the towers and messing shit up heavily, partly to intimidate them into stop drug dealing, but mostly just to get a massive power trip out of it. And this leads to the blinding of a kid in one eye. And this is Prez, who's clearly trying to fit in with a very wayward crowd. He misjudges the intimidation that Prez and Carver are going for and completely sends it into a different direction. And it's the second blunder from him after a very trigger-happy opening scene. So not the best of starts for this character. And so, following that big blunder and the ensuing kind of battle that occurs in the ghetto. We essentially end up with Daniels having gone through the whole episode, making painstaking efforts to assemble a detail that's half capable of apprehending Barksdale, and he's kind of punished for it at every turn. And no more so than in the last kick in the teeth of the episode with the phone call late at night announcing that the kid has gone blind in one eye. So I think that gives us an overall view of the episode. I think there's one other strand where McNulty ends up, well, I think it's a mixture of McNulty and Phelan ending up releasing the witness angle to the press, which doesn't go down very well with the higher ups, as you might guess from the way we saw things happen in the previous episodes. I think that pretty much everyone. I mean, the Barksdales, the new characters, I mentioned most of them. We also have our first introduction to Little Man and Ronnie Moe, who are hanging around with Weebay at the benches while Bob does his hat routine. And otherwise, I think we're up to speed on the recap and the new characters introduced. So, you want to jump into the discussion section?
Yeah, let's go for it. So the first thing that really jumped out at me with this episode is the fact that it really does begin and end and try to sort of follow throughout the episode. The idea that there is a certain distance between the cops and the people that they're working with. There is a real kind of dispassionate distance, whereby, for example, we're right at the start. We see Bunker McNulty talking about the politics, about talking about it, releasing it to the press, the general sort of in-house politics of the police when it comes to the case and who knows what. But they're surrounded by all of these bodies in this like autopsy room, and we actually see a pointed shot towards one of the surgeons sort of starting a drill or something, a saw of some kind, and starting cutting into the bodies.
Yeah.
And we see them kind of completely ignore it and just carry on with their discussion. And it feels a little off color to just be surrounded by that kind of level of sort of death, and just to be totally calm about it. And by a sort of similar effort at the very end, we can see Marla and Cedric Daniels in their nice house having their nice dinner, and they are awoken to the news that this 14-year-old kid has been blinded. And it just feels like you get this idea that the police are really distanced from the people that they're trying to help to some extent. They're not really, no matter how good their intentions are, they tend to forget about all the genuine pain and suffering that is going on around them.
Yeah, absolutely.
That kind of really struck me in this episode.
Yeah, I guess it speaks to the everyday realities of policing, and the fact is that as much as you don't want to, you perhaps become completely desensitized to the violence and the death and the murder, and it becomes a means to an end. You're just working with these corpses because it's what your job requires you to do, and it becomes a formality almost. And it's quite a sad idea, really. But when it's a nice take you had on that opening scene with the in the morgue with Dr. Fraser, who's also another character I've got to mention introduced this episode. He
yes, that's right. Yeah,
it's a really kind of stark juxtaposition between that kind of death and that apathy and that disinterest they have with it, and they're just interested in their own little career problems. So I think that's a really nice observation. Yeah,
and it's really enhanced when we see the scene with Burrell, Forrester, Rawls, and Daniels all congregating in that little office, discussing their next move and covering their asses. Basically, they don't want this to get out there, but what they're talking about is the death of a state's witness. It's a really kind of Jimmy himself says even in Baltimore that's meant to mean something.
Yeah.
And it just kind of reinforces that emotional distance, and that, like you say, there's a certain desensitization going on, which is part of the job, I suppose.
Yeah.
I'm not a police officer, so I wouldn't know.
But you can take it on trust that these guys know what they're depicting. Yeah. So I really like that scene you mentioned as well, because I think Daniels is sitting in the back, isn't he? There, and it's almost the first time you see Daniels really question the morality of it. And I think the show set him up, particularly in the first episode, as another cog in the wheel of perpetuating the stats game, and that he was so anti digging in with this. And when he hears these superiors discussing a tragic death in these terms, perhaps he's been inspired a little bit by McNulty's grandstanding performances to actually start giving a shit and question whether things should be done about this that aren't according to the status quo. And I quite like that because it's the start of a very, very strong development arc for Daniels, and it gets going very early, a lot earlier than I remember actually. So it's very good. I mean, the episode.
Do we have any references to Daniel's sort of past? Because this is something that's brought up.
Yes, that's right.
About Daniel's having a slightly sketchy past. It's not really ever revealed exactly what it is.
Yeah, but I guess you can assume that's a natural progression from when he was genuinely a very unlikable policeman into a very competent kind of career man, and now he's possibly even becoming a very sort of conscious of the morality of his work career man. But he's I think episode 3 there is the cliffhanger ending with Fitzhugh, where the dirt on Daniels is revealed, and it never comes to be a massive thing that defines Daniels, but it's often lurking in the background in scenes where...
Is it fully described? Do they go into detail into what it is?
It's actually... It depends on what you consider fully described. I mean, it's made pretty clear that he... Do you remember later in season 1 when Herc and Carver, they skim off drug busts? Or I think they at least set them up to, and perhaps they lose the money in the back of their car in the boot.
Yeah, that's right.
But,
and once there's a stack that gets stuck behind a wheel or something,
yeah.
And they,
I think there are scenes, I don't remember the specific ones, but it's pretty much established that that's what Daniels got up to back in his days on the patrol circuit in the Eastern District.
Okay. All right. I honestly don't really remember the bit where that's mentioned.
Yeah, I specifically I don't remember, but I'm pretty sure. I mean, I'm sure we're doing all the episodes. We can cross that bridge when we come to it, but I'm pretty sure that's what happens. And it's obviously, rather than a big thing that defines Daniels, it just becomes a kind of political leverage that various higher ups can use to threaten him to do things. So it's quite a nice touch with him though. I mean Daniels, like, unusually for an episode of The Wire, like, it is very Daniel centric. It's like one character centric. And I mean, I can't really think of many other episodes that aren't kind of very ensemble focused. Like there's I think Carcetti's mayoral campaign election, where it's like the election day episode, very like that is kind of Carcetti's episode. And there's also the late in season 3, I think there's a very Stringer centric episode with we all know what happens to Stringer at the end of season 3. And I think that most of the time The Wire is very careful that it pays a fleeting bit of attention to each character as we go through. But this one really felt like Daniels' episode, and I think Daniels, Lance Reddick really gave an acting masterclass, particularly in those scenes where he's really sort of dressing down subordinates or insubordinates, whichever they may be. Particularly that scene where after as the show refers to it as the 2 a.m. Field interviews. I think
that's a very, very good scene. That's a very good scene.
Particularly solid. And it's shocking how unlikable Prez was to begin with. Like, just shockingly horrible character, kind of no care in the world. So it's that scene does a lot to really bring Daniels up to speed.
And there's a similar bit. In fact, it's before that. It's when. I think, it's before that where we have, Daniels ordering McNulty to the office after, again, his name appearing, going behind Daniels' back, essentially. And there's that great zoom onto Daniels' face, where you have Bunk saying to Kiwi, I want some coffee, basically sort of leading them away because he knows that something's about to kick off. There's just this great, quick zoom, just enough to catch McNulty saying... look, Lieutenant Iwas, and it's just straight on Daniel's face. No, it's such an intense shot. You don't see. There's not many shots like that in The Wire, and it's a really nice sort of this sudden zoom. It's so dramatic.
No, definitely. I think once you've seen the show through, that actually becomes a really funny scene. You kind of know the the awkwardness that Bunk and Greggs feel towards the whole thing, and that they know that McNulty's trouble all the time. And then that zoom, I mean, it's so amateurish, isn't it? It feels kind of like this is a zoom they can only get away with it in season 1. Once they've established themselves on the scene, they need to keep things a lot more kind of professional and rigid. But yeah, it's a really interesting one. It does sort of shape.
It's a playful shot, and I think there's, I mean, maybe it could come off as a little amateurish because the wire, otherwise, visually speaking, is very set. It's very carefully framed. It's very sort of directed. It's very, very deliberate in its shots, and that feels a bit, I don't know, only half thought out. It's just a kind of a sort of dodgy zoom towards Daniels. But I feel like playful little shots like that, they do have a place, and it does have a certain humour to it, like you were saying.
And it, really kind of, I guess it mirrors the sense of annoyance that Daniels really feels with McNulty at that point. And it certainly startles the viewers anyway. What other...
He's coming at him like that train in episode 1.
Say again, sorry?
He's coming at him like that train in
yes.
episode 1.
Yeah, exactly. Almost the deer in the headlight shot, isn't it, when it just goes straight into his eyes. Yeah. One. What other main discussion point did you want to bring up for episode 2?
So, I was actually going to talk about the screens within screens, but we touched on that for the first episode, and we've talked a little bit about the visual directing style, which I think definitely comes, you start to see a little bit more of what the actual visual style of The Wire is. There is a fantastic video essay online called Visual Style in The Wire. It's on Vimeo. I cannot remember the name of the person who does it.
Yes, I know the one you mean.
But it's a fantastic video essay about style in The Wire. Just search for style in The Wire. It's a Vimeo video. It's absolutely fantastic, and it talks all about framing and the fact that although it appears to have quite pedestrian directing, it's actually, again, with the style of The Wire, is very subtle and it's very carefully shot, and so it makes shots like that Daniels one really stick out because it's very uncharacteristic. Otherwise speaking,
yeah. That video also it really pointed towards the voyeuristic style with The Wire, which kind of builds upon the whole CCTV cameras thing, but the camera's almost constantly moving. So you're constantly kind of going around these characters, and a lot of scenes begin with 10 to 20 seconds of no character on the screen. It's essentially the camera gradually moving its way towards the room. Often when it's shown isolated on the small video essay, it often comes across as really creepy actually when it sort of zooms slowly into these interrogation rooms with the little bars, and you get a real sense that this is just our little secret view into a world that we don't normally get access to, and it really builds upon.
Yeah, voyeurism is a real kind of aspect of the show style.
I mean, a wiretap by its very nature, that's what it does. Like, it takes you where you're not meant to go. So I think it's great that the show kind of embodies that through the way it's sort of, cinematography. So I think, I completely recommend that video essay as well. It's very strong. It's a Norwegian university and a Norwegian guy that did it for his thesis, I think. I'm very jealous that I didn't get to do that for my dissertation. So, yeah.
So the other thing that I was going to talk about is we are very pressed with the idea in this episode of D'Angelo's emotional state and how he is influenced by the more sort of empathetic scenarios that we see him in. And it's played in contrast to other characters as well. So, for example, when Bunk and McNulty approach D'Angelo and Bodhi as they sit on the famous orange sofa in the pit, we sort of see that Bodhi is very loyal and that he doesn't care if people knows what the rules are. He's going to stick by them anyway. He's not interested in making any kind of civil conversation with a policeman if he can help it. But D'Angelo seems a little bit more malleable. He seems like he can still be shaped, especially as far as McNulty and Bunk are concerned, because they go right ahead and take advantage of this by taking him away, taking him to the police station, into the interview room. And as you mentioned in the recap, they obviously get him to write this letter. And it's, it's a very strange scene because the audience is deceived. We are led to believe that, this is what we're hearing is true, and that they really are trying to sort of make D'Angelo feel bad. They want him to feel the guilt, and in the long term, it will get them something close to a confession. But then obviously we find out that it's all a ruse, and that the photos are from Bunk's desk. The whole, he was a church deacon, 2 jobs, it was all just a load of rubbish.
Yeah, no, that's it.
It shows that there's a real level of manipulation going on with both character and audience there. We're kind of shocked. I kind of felt it a little, especially the first time. I was like a bit shocked to learn that. I guess to speak, it seems a bit of a cliche, but you sort of think you know who the good guys are, and then they're not all of a sudden.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, we end up with Bunk essentially using, his kids as a death tragedy tool. And it links back to that thing we started with desensitization to the death of the work, or the death within the work. And, it's very strong. And again,
they're quite happy to sort of make up any old story about kids being made as orphans, which is not exactly a laughing matter, but they'll just throw it in there because it's what they need for their case. Yeah. It's all about what they want.
You can't argue that
we were talking about that before, about this is just everyone's motivations. Everyone's trying to get somewhere, and the vast majority of them don't care who they need to shit on in order to get that.
Yeah, absolutely. You can't argue that it's a very, very effective method of getting out of D'Angelo what they want to get out, and they know that he has enough of a heart to, really perhaps edge towards a confession, or at least giving up information about it. And you can tell D'Angelo wants it as well. That's why he's a lot more receptive than Bodhi is when they first approach him. Like, as much as he knows he has to live by these rules, he's really torn, and he's considering working with them because he wants justice for William Gant just as much as they do. But they're just coming from very different ends of the spectrum. So I think it's a very good scene, and obviously that shock tactic with when they pull the rug under you with Bunk's secret. It's certainly a very, they dress it up in a very subtle way. I mean, if you were to watch this on a cable show, they probably have a slow-mo shot over the Bunk's desk with the children there, and a big kind of, chime, or a big kind of
or he'd place them very kind of theatrically back on the desk.
They do a very sort of campus theatrics kind of, big reveal. These kids belong to Bunk. You've just been duped. So I think that the way they just kind of state it as a matter of fact, and Greg seems a little bit taken aback, but she kind of retains her composure.
Yeah, we see Greg's learning here.
Yeah, absolutely.
We see her being keyed up for what comes later on, when she obviously becomes a proper, detective, proper on the desk.
Yeah. Of course,
so this is like a sort of learning period for her, whether she knows it or not.
Yeah, it's a very strong scene all around. What did you? I guess we need to talk about one of the things that I really liked about this episode was evidence of really tight plotting, like right from the start. So there's that scene where Daniels visits Rhonda quite early on to try. I think his first tactic for getting better police is to ask the state's attorney if they'd get on Burrell's back about it. And during that scene, there's certainly some romantic tension in that scene, and you definitely get the sense, Rhonda, darling, sort of thing. It's clear that these guys have thought ahead for this romance, or there's certainly some sort of relationship, which doesn't brew until season 3, really. And you can also see it in the the little Barksdale family gathering or community gathering in the little hut wherever they end up. It's Donette and Stringer. Yeah. There's definitely Stringer clearly shows some interest in Donette and takes her off to find her some food and gives her a 12. So it's clearly another relationship that's got 20, 30 episodes to brew, but they've it's planted right from the start. It shows that the show has been just so tightly plotted, and it just speaks volumes for very, very well thought out storytelling. Yeah.
And we're shown, we're obviously shown between Cedric Daniels and Marla Daniels that their current relationship is not exactly, it's not shown to be this great love affair. It seems very formal and very, there for a purpose other than just love, I guess.
Yeah, no.
There's a very kind of career-minded gesture going on between the two of them, and we find out more about that as the season progresses.
Yeah, she's very kind of sternly played, very very well played. And yeah, it feels like they have a political relationship rather than a romantic one. That kind of just reflects the big bureaucratic systems in general, doesn't it? They kind of embody that through their relationship. So, yeah, it's very well done.
I think I was also going to add, it's interesting how we were talking earlier about them sort of the police covering their asses and just trying to get things done quickly for the sake of sort of saving their own self-interests. That's kind of subtly hinted at following the tower scene where we have Herc and Carver and Prez. Obviously they go to the towers and they make a bit of a mess there. And it's interesting how afterwards we see that the car that they brought along that's obviously been burnt out is left there by the police, and it almost acts as like a trophy for the Ghetto Boys. They're hanging around it, leaning against it, like it's become like a centerpiece for the towers.
Yeah.
And it's almost like a war spoils for them. It's presented in that way. It's really like, there it is in front of the towers, and they're all gathering around it. It feels like a real like artifact of the battle.
And it kind of shows how the communities in the towers are the ones who win from this dispute. Like the police have lost and everything, and the community and the towers have gained everything, sort of thing. So it's dark, and I think it really does a lot for. I think each one of these characters really is Carver, Herc, and Pred, isn't it, that go into the towers for their big field interview. I think each character responds quite interestingly, very separately. We obviously have Prez, who's desperate to kind of fit in, and up until he punches the kid, he hasn't even kicked the cloth across the floor. Like, it's all been Herc and Carver. He clearly feels the pressure to, involve himself in some sort of low level, sort of disturbance to get everyone intimidated. But he eventually comes over to this kid and thinks, let's just go for a little pistol whip. And I think he completely doesn't understand the gravity of what he's doing, and probably completely regrets it afterwards. But it's a strange one. And then you have Carver, who's clearly taken aback by this, and Carver's got a little bit of sensible guy underneath it all, I think, when he understands that that's just way beyond. And Herc just sort of formlessly stares at him, sort of just, he's just all in it for a bit of knuckle split. Is it, what do they say again? It's splitting heads and clanking knuckles, something like that, isn't it? It's their classic catchphrase.
No, I don't remember it exactly, but
they each kind of have a...
Yeah, we see Prez set up as a real Deadwood, like real just kind of furniture. I mean, he shoots a wall. We have that great scene where Keem having to explain to him that he's is he going to write on it? You got to write if you discharge your service weapon. And you got to justify the use of deadly force against a plastered wall.
Absolutely, that's another great insight into the kind of bureaucratic nature of the police. But then beyond that, I mean, you expect at least the slightest hint of an apology. His response to all that, theme is, "Give me a fucking break, okay?" Like, it's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
He doesn't back down at all. He's a complete knucklehead. And I think it's great that they set him up so depressingly, because when he finally makes that break in the 5th episode, like, he cracks that code, and like he becomes the victory story of the episode. He cracks the phone code, I think it is, by staring at it for like 5 hours. And he compares it to his word search puzzles that he used to like. It's a massively kind of cathartic moment for him. Like when Nolte comes over and gives him a big kiss. So it's really satisfying to see him kind of find his niche and slot into the detail finally, after just sort of sitting there being a spare part for the first 4 or 5 hours. So,
yeah. So with that, and the it's talking about all the major police players trying to cover their asses in their big meeting, and then we have obviously Prez, Herc, and Carver doing just the whole rushing into the towers just to make a statement, and we have McNulty and Bunk just continuing their conversations as is in that autopsy, that kind of disconnect. Conversely, we are showed a much more empathetic style from the people on the streets. So the big one is obviously D'Angelo, breaking down a little bit and wanting to write that story for those kids. That's obviously based off manipulation, but it shows his real kind of empathy being called to. We also see Bubbles helping the detail, essentially for free, although he does end up getting some money in the end. But he's sort of happy to work for free. He's doing something for his friend. He's doing it selflessly. And we also see, I think there's another example. Just trying to think of how. Oh yeah, we see, like, for example, we see a lot more of you mentioned it before, we see the Barksdale family. We see what appears to be Avon helping out in some kitchen.
Yeah.
Not really sure exactly what he's doing.
Carving some turkey breast, I think, isn't it?
Something about ribs.
Yeah, that's it. And he's again, it just builds towards this kind of double-edged lifestyle of, very efficient drug-based murder and keeping everyone in order versus the whole family values that he has. And you can tell that he clearly, I love it when he takes D'Angelo's son, calls him his little soldier and tests his grip out. Like, it speaks so much volumes towards who Avon is. And that
But it really does feel like there's a emphasis on appealing to the bits and pieces of the lives of the people on the street that we can empathize with, and showing that they are willing to be selfless where the police are selfish and covering their asses. And there seems to be a real kind of emphasis on showing that contrast.
Absolutely. I think that another thing that builds towards this sort of idea that we're finding between police that are desensitized to, life and the criminals that, build towards it. You have, I think perhaps almost caricaturely or in caricature style, you have, what they call Pope and Mahone, and all they care about in the slightest is their, overtime slips, don't they? And they don't have the slightest interest in, listening to what's going on. And that they possibly, a bit like Rules last time, I think they were the ones that came across perhaps too heavy to begin with. But I guess they really didn't need to make a point that a lot of the police is just a bunch of people who aren't motivated, and it becomes all about the money again.
Well, those two characters aren't particularly, they don't have loads of depth or anything. They're fairly simple characters.
Yeah, they're just almost to set the scene of incompetency at the start, aren't they? They're almost just plot devices. Yeah.
But I think we're thrown off somewhat by Prez, because we have a lot more time with him. We're more likely to remember the incompetencies of Prez than Polka Mahone.
Yeah.
And I think that perhaps goes some way to demonstrate that they are useless, but they also make so little noise, so little fuss, that they are able to slip under the radar in that way.
Yeah, because it's a common theme throughout the first half of the season is how those two, I think Santangelo as well, they spend most of the day getting McNulty and the others to cover for them while they slip away. And as you say, because they're not making the fuss, they completely get away with it, and they still get paid at the end of the day. So they're, by some thoughts, they're the ones that are winning. Like they're getting the best value for money in terms of the work they do, at the cost of everyone else. It's strange. But I think those two as well. There's a great thing I thought with, I think a lot of Wire fans say that one of the reasons they love the show is its rewatchability, and the fact that you can continue to see new things after like the third or the fourth viewing, like every time you go through. And there was one thing that I saw this episode that I thought was great, like really nice bit of, almost like duality with there's a couple of scenes where, I think it's, the judge and then Santangelo, they're mopping things up. I think the judge is mopping up mustard.
Yeah, this is the you missed a spot.
Missed a spot thing. Okay, so fair enough. That's a nice kind of callback. That's kind of a nice link between scenes. But then also when, I think it's Mahone that tells Santangelo he missed a spot, and Santangelo asks him why he can't do it, and he says, it's seniority. And if you compare that with the industry of the dock workers, the stevedores, you see that seniority becomes a cause for work with them, and with the police it becomes a cause to avoid work. So it's a complete kind of, complete contrast between the motivations of the characters. And I thought it was a really nice thing that won't really be delivered until the second season, of course, but it's a really nice parallel.
Yeah, that's a good spot.
Yeah.
I think I was going to talk a little bit more about, seeing as I got the chance, talk a little bit more about the more technical side of the directing, so, visual and audio style. Obviously, it goes without saying that in The Wire, there's only diegetic music throughout. So we only have music playing when there's some kind of in-world device that's able to play it. So it's on radios on people's cars and in their houses and MP3 players and whatnot. But there's like maybe one or two examples where we move away from diegetic music. So that's obviously an interesting aspect of The Wire because there's no soundtrack to speak of, really.
Yeah.
Would you say that you really notice it? Does it feel missing at any point?
There's definitely that point where it's done subtly so that you're not meant to notice it, but I think there's a point after you've watched a few episodes that you realise that the show really is different and that you haven't heard any sort of, grandstanding soundtracks. But I think one of the things that, and if you listen to it with headphones particularly, one of the things that's quite great is that the ambient sounds in the show are actually really detailed. There's a lot of like conversations going on in the street in the background and kind of big surround sound honks in the distance and lots of noises that are relevant to the various environments. So it's clear that they've put a lot of effort into filling out the soundtrack almost with ambient noises rather than with kind of out of the scene noises that are used to direct the audience rather than to be heard by the characters. So I thought that it's just a very nice different approach that was not noticeable by any means, but certainly something that you definitely pick up on after a while. And of course, by episode,
Sorry, Karen.
No, not worry. By episode 6, when they do have that weird, I actually quite like it. Actually, it's that scene where Avon and his heavies roam through the low rises to reward the scope and the relay of Omar's boyfriend, isn't it?
We have some non-diegetic music there.
That's right. It's a very appropriate tune, but it's perhaps an inappropriate usage. I quite enjoyed it, but it's very jarring considering they've spent 5 hours following this kind of rigid structure of diegetic music only. So, yeah, that'd be my take on it.
There's also another interesting use of sound where we have the small team of Greggs, Herc and Carver going up to that roof. Obviously take some photos. That's when we have Bubbles doing the hat game. And before we see them go up to the towers, we see someone drumming on like some old pans or old buckets or something. And we, again, going on to that theme of voyeurism in the visual style, we don't ever get to see the building that they're on from where the police are looking down. We never really get to see that building from the street people's perspective. But instead it uses that cue of the sound of the drums in the distance that's playing quietly when they're on the top of the roof, so you know that they must be nearby to that. I thought it was a neat sort of audible cue that this is where they are. They're not showing it to you, but it's kind of a clue as to their location. And then we have the sort of the shots with the telescopic lens where we're sort of seeing it from their perspective. So again, it's another nice shot where their position is meant to be obscured from the dealers, and thus it is also obscured from us as the audience. Like, we don't see it either.
Absolutely, no. It's very clever. It's not something I'd paid much mind to, but it makes a lot of sense because, it does seem strange that they wouldn't show us the full perspective of the shot with the Greggs with their camera in the distant background. But I guess they want us to empathise with the characters. Perhaps we shouldn't see that because we're meant to understand that these characters are completely unaware of that voyeurism going on. So that's really nice actually, and it's also quite interesting visually when they open the scene with this little kid banging the little paint can. It's a nice kind of introduction to this chapter of the project life. So.
And there's another interesting shot where we see the detail coming down to their office, such as it is, basically being in next to a sewer or waterworks of some kind, it seems. There's a good shot where Daniels opens the door and looks down, and we sort of see him farther away at the top of the stairs, and this blackness sort of enveloping the stairs as it comes down. And it's a real sort of down the rabbit hole kind of shot, because they're descending into where the detail will be taking place. It's almost like they're falling into the darkness of the case. It's a real visual metaphor going on there.
Yeah, absolutely. With that's the scene you're referring to when they have that strange sequence of shots of various. It's kind of gradually getting towards the detail room, right, where it's the exterior. But yeah, absolutely. It's a strange one, actually.
And then we see Daniels open the door, and there's, like I say, there's that sort of down the rabbit hole style shot.
Yeah.
Where he's sort of looking into the darkness, and it's sort of, here we go, you're going into the case for real now.
Absolutely, yeah. I was trying to work out why that scene was there. That's that strange slideshow of shots, but I think that the Wire always places scenes next to each other that are in separate locations, and clearly on this occasion they had to move time on in the detail room, but having to announce it somehow, and they clearly had to put this little slideshow of scenes in, or little snapshots of the exterior, which not only acts as a nice kind of visual indicator, but it separates it by time. Good. Yeah.
So maybe we should delve a little more into any negative or more critical aspects of this episode that we wanted to point out. Is there anything you want to start off with?
There's certainly less to talk about than with the first episode. There seems to find their footing here. I did mention a little bit that I think Poke and Mahone, there we go, are perhaps dealt with a little bit heavily, and they don't quite feel nuanced enough for everyone else. But as we said, they're more signposting plot devices than characters, so it's fairly forgivable. I remember sort of shouting at the screen the first time I watched this, saying, Perk and Carver, you're so stupid. What are you doing here? I think once you've watched it again, you can see that it's clearly just a flaw of their characters and a flaw of the writer. But I remember not being quite understanding of that scene to begin with. And again, it's probably more a limitation of not knowing the characters enough to really understand what their thought process is there. But I seem to remember that being quite frustrating on the first viewing. And I think there might be one line that doesn't quite work. It's when Carver is up on the roof with Greg, and she's just getting into her work, and he asks her, when did you figure you liked women better than men? And I couldn't quite work out why he was asking that question like at that point. It almost felt like it was a signpost of one of Greg's character traits, just for the sake of it. I don't know if you found a good justification for it.
Or of one of Carver's. I guess it was just meant to be a sort of, he's not focused on the job.
Yeah, perhaps it speaks to that, but it's...
But, on the other hand, it's immediately followed by Greg's leaving, handing the camera to Carver, who then proceeds to start taking photos, and Herc to chat idly to him.
Yeah.
And for Carver to say, will you shut up a second?
Yeah.
So I guess there's a certain, passing on of the indignance.
Yeah, a sequence of incompetence. Yeah, there's always going to be one person to get in your way. Yeah, no, I like that. I like that reading. It makes a lot of sense, actually. Yeah.
We also have, because you're talking about characters, maybe not being introduced in an ideal manner, perhaps we could say maybe this is either intentional or it's a product of a limited runtime, which is something we obviously discussed for the first episode. But we have Prez and Lester Freeman obviously being introduced in this episode as well. Two extremely, extremely important characters for the show in general. But, Lester enters with a bit of a sigh and Prez is just an idiot. But we know in the long term that's not what their characters are. Do you think that this introduction is being done intentionally, or is it just a product of runtime? Or because either way, it didn't really work for their characters as a whole. It's a bit deceiving, actually.
Yeah, I think particularly with Freeman, it was a nice choice because we see that Freeman is just so cynical towards any sort of police work now. He's been through 13 years of just pure boredom.
And 4 months.
And 4 months. Let's not forget his massively pedantic approach to his time in the pawn shop. But he's just so completely lost faith in the system, and it takes some sort of impetus for him to come out of that shell almost. And it's not until I think it's once he realizes that there's going to be a pager intercept that comes along, and he realizes that McNulty is perhaps a lot more than you might realize. Then he might first consider. He's not just an egomaniac. He does actually get good work done if he's given the right opportunities for it. I think he saw an opportunity there to get back to his former self. So I think his quietness here is a nice choice, and it really does create a nice kind of dramatic arc for him in the first season when he slowly opens his shell.
And he is described as a house cat, and he certainly behaves in that manner, more or less. So seems reasonable.
You see from the start that he's not a stupid gentleman at all. Like he's earning, I think it's $300 a piece, isn't it, from that miniature furniture carving that he does. And like he's found himself the ultimate hobby that can sustain him financially without the police work. Just gives him something to do. So he's a really well drawn character, right down to his furniture. And Prez was the other one, wasn't it? Again, I mean, I was talking about it earlier, how he's that big cathartic moment in episode 5 where he solves and cracks the code, and he kind of becomes the go-to cryptic guy, the guy who cracks the codes and works out the lingo and solves the jargon. And I like the fact that it takes a while for people to sort of slot into their roles. It's not, you haven't got an archetype from the start, you have to find it first.
Interestingly, that sort of shows the desire for The Wire to, let you give people a chance, because we see a lot of characters start in particular places and maybe not start very well, but like you say, they slot in further down the line. The show intentionally forces you into particular feelings about characters in order for you to give them a chance later on, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Rather than try to establish an ideal version of that character from the outset, it's making sure that there is an actual arc for you to make sense of with each character, which, is a testament to the writing. I mean, I do find that a lot of shows sort of start with the ideal version of that character and still give them some conflict, but ultimately they don't really change that much, really. They don't find their place as much. And I think it's good that they placed an emphasis on that for the people in the detail, because it starts off as such a mishmash of random people from random units that they all need to find their place within the detail.
Yeah, absolutely. It speaks to reality, really. When you first assemble a team, you're not just all going to assume these given archetypes that the writer wants you to. You're going to have to work at it to see who bounces off who and the rest of it. And it's good at changing our perceptions of characters and, helping us not to prejudge people and see that there's, idiots that are not suited to this, but, absolutely excel at this, and everyone kind of has a slot. So, yeah, absolutely.
I would say there's also one very small, it's more of a sort of a technical mistake rather than actual major criticism, but right at the very start, where we see them taking photos of Gant's body, you only have to look sort of half carefully at Gant himself, and you can see that he's blinking every time the camera flash goes off. It's really quite obvious.
Oh, right, no way.
It's like, so every time the camera flash goes off, you can see him blinking.
You've certainly been given the...
That's not a very dead body.
Been giving The Wire some close scrutiny there, haven't you? That's
Well, you don't. It's not even that. Like, it's not like you have to really look. It's pretty. Watch it again. It's pretty obvious.
I'll give it.
Once you see it, you'll never unsee it. It's one of those things. Once you spot
Maybe
it,
I better not start. No,
it will just never go away.
Yeah. Have you got your favourite scenes?
Okay. So, favourite scenes.
Do you want to go first for this one?
Well, we kind of already mentioned one of the big ones, which is Daniel's very, very serious telling off of Herc, Carver, and Prez. He really establishes his dominance in that scene. Sort of this very... Again, there's a lot of intensity from it. He really kind of like steps forward and big, hard stares. And
yeah.
It's a great scene because Daniel's he absolutely dominates, and the Prez, Herc, and Carver, they just come across as embarrassed schoolboys in it. It's a very satisfying scene. Very satisfying.
Definitely. No, his eyes, I think Lance Reddick's eyes are just fantastic. Like, he's built for that role, that kind of intimidation tactic. When he squares up the Prez to alter his statement to the internal later on, I think it's very well delivered, and like, his stance is perfect. I think for me, it was, one thing we haven't mentioned is the chicken nugget scene, which is, I think it's often kind of a
the McDonald's analogy.
Yeah, and you not only have the analogy to kind of capitalism in general, but you have I love the fact that he refers to the basement, and you instantly think of McNulty as kind of the inventor of the chicken nugget, and undiscovered talent or unloved talent, more or less. So it's a great idea, and I think everything that happened with D'Angelo and Tonka McNulty, the scoop up in the project, and then the following interrogation scene for me really stood out as the strong points in the episode.
Yeah, absolutely.
The interplay between the police and the street characters. So there we go. I think that was my favorite parts of the episode.
I think extra shout out for the hat game scene, just because I specifically remember when I watched this episode for the first time, that I really kind of appreciated the ingenuity of that idea, like sort of placing hats on people. It's so simple, but it's just it's another one of those really sort of satisfying moments where you're like, oh, that's clever.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a simple concept. And you probably tell that Bubbles was, genius enough to think it up himself. It makes him, again, there's that scene with Bubbles that we haven't mentioned where, McNulty first meets him. And you really get the sense that, I'm sure you mentioned it about the money, but he
says that he's willing to do it for free.
That's
because
right,
obviously they beat the hell out of Johnny earlier on.
Although it does ruin it a little bit at the end where he eventually caves and asks for a bit of payment anyway.
Yeah.
I guess then everyone would do the same in that situation. It's nice to finally put a bit of what we commented last time, that Bubbles wasn't really shown much of in the first episode. You get a sense that he's got a real morality and a kind of an old school sense of community that no one else around him seems to adopt. It used to be Johnny, who is
well, I think it also leads back to what I was saying before about there being more empathetic elements to the street in this episode, and how we see people sticking their neck out. Bubbles sticks his neck out for Johnny. We have the people throwing the bottles and TVs down after their people have been assaulted. They're kind of, they're sort of sticking their neck out for the people on their side that have been wronged.
Yeah.
We see, obviously D'Angelo sort of arguably, with a little bit of persuasion, sticking his neck out for these imaginary children that he's writing a letter to.
Yeah.
Whether he knows it or not, he is sort of making that gesture. So, but yeah, that's it's one of those scenes, and that bubble scene is a particularly good scene because it just highlights that he's scheming. We see a lot of his scheming already, but that we see that he has kind of good schemes that can do, can help rather than just get him money to make his next score.
Yeah, absolutely.
Score his next bit of heroin.
Nice bit of balance to him. Yeah, so that covers favourite scenes. So that just leaves standout character, title, and epigraph. So
yeah.
What was who stood out for you this week then?
It's a very Daniels heavy episode, and he is I do really like Daniels as a character, so it's got to be.
Yeah.
It's got to be Daniels for me.
I'm completely in the same wavelength as you. Consistently throughout my first viewing, season 1, he was my go-to character. He was great. I loved how kind of serious he was. He didn't take any shit. He was completely focused on the job. Didn't have any time for jokes. It seemed that the way he'd lived with his wife had kind of made him that person. This very kind of formulaic, logical approach to life without much cause for fun. And the way that kind of translated to his job was great, and the struggles he had with the ups and downs. So yeah, definitely Daniel. The title this time round is again pretty not showy. Don't go for the showy titles here. The detail.
Yeah, it's
Again,
pretty obvious. The detail. It's about the detail.
yeah. I struggle to think of other causes. I was thinking perhaps there might be some tenuous connection with the more traditional meaning of like detail as in the devil's in the details sort of thing. But
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I came up with trumps with that one. I'm sure investigations require a focus on details more than any other kind of endeavor. So perhaps I just kind of feed to that. But yeah, it's I think it's slightly more focused on the target. And it has less.
At a stretch, you could possibly say that level of distance. Again, that level of sort of distance between the police and the street, and the genuine suffering and the genuine kind of hurt and all the people dying, that kind of distance. That's the detail they're missing.
Yeah.
They're kind of consistently missing that. That's of all the details they've got about, who's doing what and all the communication. It doesn't matter what information they've got about the players. The detail they do genuinely seem to miss is that a lot of people get really badly hurt when they make these big decisions, and that there's a lot of real coldness to the job. And, when they're sat in that room and talking about this dead state's witness as if it's just this, oh, what a hassle for us. That's kind of that's the one detail they're missing.
Yeah. Absolutely. That works with me.
That's at a stretch.
Yeah. I think that's a fair analysis. We're certainly stretched this week. There's, not a lot to go on. I think the epigraph though has certainly got a bit more gravitas to it this week.
Absolutely.
And it's one of my favourites actually. You cannot lose if you do not play. And I mean, you can apply it to the whole game of drug dealing. You can even apply it to, life in general. I mean, if you attach yourself to something, or if you commit yourself to something, it's a common, speech of, David Simon, where he talks about the show is essentially about people who commit to institutions, choose to play the game because they have to, and always lose because the system's rigged against them. And again, it ties in nicely with why'd you let him in the game, from the previous week. So, I think it applies on a number of levels, not least just Daniels' little predicament with the, giving up his people for the 2 a.m. raids. So it's a very kind of multi-dimensional epigraph.
And it calls back a little on Polka Mahone as well, because although they're in the institution, they don't play with fire. They don't try and get themselves involved, and they don't really lose anything out of it.
Yeah.
They get their OT, they get their hours, they come out with their money, and as we see later on in the season, they they really do kind of fake their way into success.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess who's another one that works with? It's William Gant, more starkly than anyone. He chose to play the game when it was posed to him in that courtroom, and very quickly he lost, with less than 24 hours following. It was there for him to play. He went with it, and it's a poor choice. So it's a very kind of cold but very elucidating statement.
And it also comes to mind when we have the scene with Levy coming to rescue D'Angelo, as it were, telling him to, don't say anything, don't write anything. Again, he's not going to lose anything if he just shuts up and does nothing.
Yeah.
It kind of comes to mind in that scene as well.
Which was a great parade by Maurice Levy, by the way. I thought that was a fantastic entrance. Yeah. A little slap around the head.
Yeah. Yeah, he's kind of comes across as a bit of a father figure.
Yeah, absolutely. You'd have thought he'd perhaps be a bit more careful with his disciplining these cold hard criminals, but maybe he knows more about Dee than the rest of them.
And there's a reinforcement that he is there often, because he literally comes in and just goes room 1, room 2. He's kind of, he's obviously a common visitor.
Yeah, absolutely. Pulled away from his brisket with a vet.
That's the title and the epigraph sorted.
Okay, so I think, unless there's anything else you'd like to discuss, I think that's pretty much an hour, isn't it?
That's episode 2. That's the detail. If you want to share some thoughts about the podcast or the episode, or if you had something that you wanted to add to what we were saying, or if you completely disagree with something that we were saying, then send it over to us at caughtonthewire@gmail.com. And this episode and the previous episode and all subsequent episodes will be up on the website at caughtonthewire.wordpress.com. So until next week, where we have episode 3, we shall see you then. Enjoy your week.
Bye-bye.
What you know about Baltimore? Baltimore. What you know about Baltimore? What you know about Baltimore? Baltimore. What you know about Baltimore?